And I've promised twice that we will be talking to somebody from not KFC. What am I saying? YFC. Gee, that was a bit of a Freudian slip there, wasn't it? Yeah, Youth for Christ. We've got in the studio Jason and Esther from Youth for Christ. So good morning to both of you.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
It's our pleasure. It really is. Now, we may have some listeners who have no idea what YFC do. So tell us a little bit about the organisation and what its mission in life is.
Sure. So Youth for Christ, which shortened we call it YFC, is an international organisation in over 100 nations globally. And our key focus is that every young person in every tribe and nation and from people group and language background has the opportunity to hear about Jesus and then be discipled into a local church. So that looks different in every nation. So in some nations that might look like high school programs. In other nations that might look like drug rehabilitation or juvenile justice. In other places it might look like sports clubs.
So there's no one model.
No one model, and it's very deliberately about locals for locals.
Yeah.
So it's international, but we don't really send people. It's about people in Singapore reaching young people in Singapore.
Oh, well, there you go. That's one thing I've learned. I thought it was about sending people out.
No,
but it's about equipping the local people to sort of do the thing themselves.
Exactly, because what we've realised is that the people that are there on the ground, that speak the language, understand the culture, they're the most effective at meeting the needs of young people and introducing Jesus to them. So we use those local people. Sometimes we send people to upskill. So that's what Jason and I do. But mostly it's all about Indigenous missionaries working with local people. So.
I think that's good because otherwise there are sort of overtones of colonialism, people coming in like, we are the experts. This is what you should think. This is what you should do. And it's not culturally sensitive, is it?
Exactly. And I think too, the reality is that we learn as much from them as they do from us. So that is something we constantly remind people that we're working with too.
Okay, thanks for that overview, Esther. As I say, I learned something there. We've also got Jason in the studio. I'll get them to tell a little bit about each other. Jason and Esther, you are a couple, aren't you? So you know each other quite well.
Yeah.
So Jason, introduce Esther to us. Tell us about Esther.
Okay, so Esther's my wife. We've been married since 2006. We have 2 children, and they are currently not in the studio with us, or else you wouldn't hear anything.
Thank goodness.
My son would not be quiet for the entire time.
All right.
But no, Esther is an amazing person who is very able to relate to all sorts of different people. She has multiple degrees in all sorts of weirdness, and she's amazingly organised, and that's coming from somebody who has no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what wives are really good at organising husbands anyway. So
together you make a complete house.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, Esther, tell us about Jason.
So Jason has this uncanny ability to just engage with someone one-on-one. So it's funny because he's an introvert and incredibly happy to just sit quietly amongst large groups of people. But he, one-on-one, he can have the most profound conversations with people. He always has these intense conversations with people on planes. I get on a plane and I fall asleep. He has these full-on conversations about God and all this kind of stuff. So he is incredible from that perspective, and which is interesting for the role that he's in now because he's working with our nations across Asia Pacific to build up young leaders and young leader development. So he's getting to work one-on-one and in small groups with the young people and the national leaders around our area. So
that leads me very nicely into my next question. I'll go back to Jason. What is it that you do for YFC if you don't send out missionaries, as it were? What's the role of you guys?
So we actually both started with working directly with young people. So I used to work in Sydney, and then I moved to Newcastle, and I was the director in Newcastle for a few years. Esther joined once we got married and had our first child. And so we spent a lot of time working directly with young people, which is amazing. But now we're old. We're 40 and 41.
I didn't want to say anything. Yeah.
Now that we're way past it, we have been asked to actually train the next generations. I mean, we've got experience and we've got lots to give, but at the same time, they need somebody who will champion them and allow them not just to learn from what we've done, but take it 2 or 3 or 4 steps further. Because ultimately, our experience is 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. So you need to train up the next generation of leaders to sort of, keep the organisation with some momentum and impetus.
Yeah, and with the young people, with the energy they have and the connection they have worldwide, they are far more able to reach their peer group than we are, who are way over the hill. But I think the thing for us is that as we develop young people into these leaders, they're going to take the gospel much wider than where we could ourselves now.
Yeah.
And that's our job. Our job is to not just train people, but to help them multiply what they're doing in their own country, in their own context, in their own language, so that the gospel goes further and further and further wide.
Yeah. Going back to Esther, do you find that the skills needed for the next generation of young people are maybe completely different than the skills you needed, because we live in such a different age, don't we, technologically, screen time, all the rest of it? Is it a different set of skills that leaders need now?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's the same. So fundamentally it's all about relationship and it's all about connecting relationally. But what that looks like is very different. And it is... This set of skills is all about engaging online and engaging in new and different ways. So it's a big learning curve for those of us who are, I guess to use Jason's word, championing the next set of leaders.
Yeah.
But as long as we stay open to new things and we continue to put the power in the hands of the young leaders instead of, and the next generation of leaders, instead of wanting them to do things the way we have done them.
That's the risk, isn't it?
Right.
It worked for us, so why doesn't it work for you?
But the reality is that it doesn't, and the key phrase that we use within YFC is anchored to the rock, who is Jesus, but geared to the times.
Yeah.
And so as long as we continue to stay connected to Jesus, but be looking at how do we need to do this differently? What is the current generation of young people needing from us? And then adjusting that accordingly. So our role really is about finding the people who already have the skills, and then empowering them to then put those skills to action.
There is a danger for my generation, at least. We look at all this technology that's available and the various apps that are available, and we can be very negative and dismissive about it, but it does present wonderful opportunities as well, doesn't it? If you have the right people in leadership roles to develop that and use it properly and wisely.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're going to break for some more music. We'll come back. We'll have a bit of a longer chat with Jason and Esther after we've been talking to Esther and Jason, and they're explaining to us the work that they do for YFC. Now, you're here in Australia because you've sat in the studio in front of me, but you spend a large part of your time abroad, don't you? Esther, where do you get off to?
So there's lots of different places that we travel to. In Asia Pacific alone, we have 5 different regions. So Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and then the Pacific. So we basically access those regions as needed. So this year alone, we've headed to the Pacific. We've been in East Asia twice. We haven't made it to Central Asia this year, but we have done that in the past. So basically anywhere that needs us.
Yeah.
So whether they have a training need, or I also have a prayer role as well. So if there's a prayer need, I was in Southeast Asia earlier this year, working on workshopping how to pray and build prayer into your teams and leadership. So we do that as well. So anywhere that there's those kinds of needs, we go. Yeah, there is a lot of time. I spend a lot of time in front of a computer.
I think everybody does this day and age, don't they? It's rather depressing, but it's got to be done.
But it gives us the opportunity to utilise and access our nations too.
Yeah.
Like it's an incredible, Zoom is an incredible resource as well. So
Yeah, but I can hear there's a but when everybody mentions Zoom these days. Yeah, Zoom is great. We loved it, but
yes.
Yeah.
It's an alternative, but it is not as helpful as face to face.
Yeah. So, Jason, do you find the various countries that you visit in these sort of these Asian regions, do they differ in the way that the way they take the message of Christ to their people? Is it different in country A and country B? Does it differ greatly?
Yeah, it does. So just a little bit of background. The best way to understand this is that because YFC does not send missionaries to countries to establish something and then make it look like YFC, each nation has their own identity. Each nation researches their own needs and meets their own needs the way they feel they need to be met, which means that you may have a country right next door and they could be within an hour's driving distance and they'll run totally different programs, totally different outreaches, totally different discipleship stuff, simply because they see their need and they're not bound by what a YFC program is. They're bound by what God's calling them to do. And that's what they do. And that's what we try and encourage, and that's what we try and train them for, and that's what that's why we see so much diversity.
It makes it difficult for you guys as the trainers and the resources people because there isn't just one training manual, I don't suppose. It looks different every time you present the course according to the country that you're in.
We very much function with the same training principles, but the content changes from nation to nation and even from group to group within that nation, depending on what it looks like. So, we in our team, we have a real focus on experiential, interactive learning. So we're very much about getting them engaging with each other and learning from each other, and from that, then making their own decisions about what things need to look like. But so we use the same, I guess, principles. And then it changes drastically depending on the nation.
It's not off the peg. It's made to measure.
Exactly. Exactly.
Do you get any sense from the visits to these countries that you make how the word of Christ is being received? Can you give our listeners some reason to be hopeful and sort of positive about the message of Christ being received in these countries?
So I think for me, these trips are so encouraging. I think sometimes in our, Western mindset in a place like Australia where really we have everything we need, and, our idea of persecution is that, maybe we're not allowed to be so noisy on a Sunday morning or something like that, So getting to go to these places where literally your life is on the line, suddenly you believing in something and your faith becomes such a core part of who you are. And, we get the opportunity to meet these people who truly sharing Jesus, it's not just that it's important, but it's almost like to some other level, because sharing Jesus could have them end up in jail or have them end up, worse. So suddenly...
It's life and death, isn't it?
It is life and death in some of our nations. And so suddenly it becomes so much more important and so much more valuable to them, I think. Sometimes I think we take it for granted, So I guess, is there hope? I think the hope is almost reverse. It's hope for us that if we can hear these stories and be encouraged, that might reignite our faith. And
you've touched on something there which I probably was aware of but sort of hadn't confronted directly, that there are countries, and we won't mention their names, but there are countries around the world and in the region where to sort of tell people about Jesus Christ, it is life and death. It's a crime. The people that are working for YFC, they must be very brave people.
Well, if I can, we have a couple of countries in the Central Asian region, which I'm not going to mention the names of, because they're sensitive. They have just finished doing a 5-year project, a youth conference project, where they brought together multiple countries into one place to have their first ever youth conference. And it was so large and so amazing that they actually went to their federal politicians and said, this is happening. Even though it's illegal, we are doing it. Letting you know, and
not asking your permission.
Not asking permission, just letting you know this is happening. And
they couldn't really. It was so large that they
couldn't keep it quiet.
They couldn't keep it quiet.
No. And it was amazing. It was a fantastic. I was unable to go to the actual conference, but I was there during the lead up, and these guys were passionate beyond belief, and they didn't care what happened to them. They were so desperate to see Jesus reach into other people's lives that their life didn't matter.
It's like an like a New Testament story of the disciples and the people spreading the word throughout Asia Minor and those places, and getting into those places where their lives were at risk. And we think, oh yeah, but that was 2,000 years ago. It's not.
It happens today.
It's happening today. Sharing the word of Christ can lead to a prison sentence.
Exactly.
Just like it did for Paul.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, sometimes I think apathy is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And I think in nations like ours, it's easy to become apathetic. And hearing these stories is so important for people like us to remember how important it is to actually put your life on the line in some way. It'll look different for an Australian.
Of course. Yeah.
But, what does that look like for you? Maybe that looks like standing up for someone at school who's being bullied, or maybe that looks like feeding someone who doesn't have the money to buy their groceries, or, that maybe there's those ways in our context. But it's these incredible stories that remind us to take that seriously.
Yeah. Before we break for some more music, it's not just the YFC people in those countries who are taking the word to Christ. It must be very brave of those people who respond, because perhaps their family members don't approve of what they're doing. So the more you think about it, the more, well, not dangerous, but the more awe-inspiring those stories are. It's not just YFC people, but you might be ostracized by your family, cut off financially, thrown out of the home. I mean,
exactly.
For Christ. You've been persecuted for Christ.
Exactly. And we get to hear stories like that of young people who have chosen to respond to Jesus's call on their lives, even though that might mean that they're no longer a part of their families and no longer, and then those people through that obedience go on to lead new ministries in Youth for Christ, or go on to lead. You've met some church planters that have started like that. It just. Big things come from small, obedient moments.
It's inspiring, isn't it? Let's break the Central Coast. We're chatting away to Jason and Esther this morning. They've been telling us about the work of YFC, the work that Jason and Esther do in training the next generation of leaders for that organisation in the region. How do you get on with the churches? How are you... do the churches welcome you into these areas that you go into?
So the key focus for us, really, I mentioned earlier on in our interview that our whole role is about introducing Jesus to young people and discipling them into local churches. So YFC without healthy partnerships with churches is nowhere near as effective as YFC with healthy partnerships with churches. But as we've said a lot already, nations are unique. Areas within nations are unique. So some places have these really strong, great relationships with churches where that partnership is seen as really important. Other places might have, a partnership with one or two churches. Other places it might be brand new. So those relationships are just starting. But as a foundation, we try to start in a place where we're building really, really healthy relationships with our local churches and inviting them in to our ministries. So they become our volunteer base and our prayer support and our financial partners as well.
Yeah. So the idea is that the youth, they meet Christ through the work that YFC do, but then they are then fed into a local church where their spirit can be nourished and nurtured.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Each of our staff too, regardless of where they are, we're required to actually serve in our local church. So it's not just a one-way thing. So we're not always just asking, come and do our stuff. We actually are investing heavily in our local church region, our own town, our cities, our states, our whatever it might be. So we try very hard not to be an island to ourselves.
No. Sort of a seamless transition from I was with Youth for Christ and all of a sudden I'm here at church.
Yes, exactly. It's that understanding that YFC is not a church. It's a para-church organisation, almost like a bridge between the community
that's a good
and
word
the
picture,
church.
isn't it?
Exactly. It's the path that people can get from the community into the church.
Yeah.
So.
How can our listeners help? Prayer would be a good way. What does YFC need prayer for?
Prayer is always incredibly helpful. The overarching prayer request that we always have is just workers. The harvest is plentiful.
Yeah.
But our workers are overworked.
Yeah.
So having many, many more workers would be great. Obviously, we're a mission organisation, so we have to raise our own income.
Yeah.
So in that, saying we need more workers, that also means we need people that can support us financially and support the people that are coming financially. And that looks different in every nation.
Yeah.
But they're the two kind of key foundational needs.
And as far as that prayer is concerned, from what you were saying earlier, if our listeners could pray for the safety of those workers in those countries where you say it's really quite dangerous to do this.
Exactly. Prayer for safety and wisdom to know
and sensitivity,
what and when and how, and how exactly to go about things. That's definitely a need. We also have so every other month we have a prayer gathering that everyone is welcome to. So if people would like to join that, they can reach out to prayer at YFCI, prayer.ap@yfci.org, and then we can get you added to that prayer list.
I'm going to ask Esther to write that down, and I'll give out that address a number of times before we finish today.
Sounds good.
So I'll get Esther to do that, and we'll repeat it a few times. And if people want to learn more about the work and maybe they are moved to make a donation, that would be through the YFC website, would it?
Right. So if you do feel moved and you want to give financially, become a financial partner, then the best way to do that is actually to go to the YFCI.org.
YFCI?
Yes, Youth for Christ International.
All right,
YFCI.org /donate. And then if you want to give to training within the Asia Pacific area, once you get to the donate section, you're then going to put in 60012.
60012.
612.
Perfect. I can remember that. 612. Yes, that makes, I can remember that one. But prayer, and if you are able to make a donation, that would be, that would be a bonus. That would be fantastic. But as with everything, prayer is, it's foundational, isn't it? So prayer, we pray that, God would continue to bless Jason and Esther in the work that they do, that he would continue to keep them safe as they travel around the world, sort of resourcing and training the people in the field. And we just pray God's message would be spread sensitively, wisely and beautifully across all the countries that they're present in.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, Esther. It's terrific work that you're doing.